I'm awake. Are you?
I wonder how many miles I've fallen. It seems I'll get to the center of the earth. Curious, isn't it? And really, nothing's quite impossible.
Let's go now to our new episode of the Unfiltered Rise with me, Heidi Love.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unfiltered Rise with me, Heidi Love. And today I have with me an amazing guest, David Livingstone, who has been doing this and down the rabbit hole for over 30 years. He knows a thing or two, I'm telling you. He's a multi-book author. He has his own website. He's been up to a lot of exposing, and I am just thrilled to have you here, David. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you. It's a true honor.
And will you let my audience know a little bit about your projects and what you have going on right now?
Sure. So my name is David Livingstone. So like you said, I've been at it over 30 years. I'm really an independent scholar. I did start out in university, but it became evident to me that the university system was what I call a form of higher indoctrination. And there's ways to manage it these days, but I was young and hot-headed at the time, so I decided to quit and protest. And but the fortunate thing is that it freed me to study at my own pace, which was a lot more rigorous than what the university system was willing to put me through, and I could follow the threads and the clues at my own discretion. So large part of what I've been doing is deconstructing what effectively is the propaganda that we've been taught, or I was taught in university. And it's what they teach us is a pretty simple story, but it takes a lot of work to unravel. And I have been astounded to see to what extent that is the case. And pretty much in every book that I've written, I believe that I have thoroughly studied the subject. So in the subsequent book, I'm always astounded of how much more information tends to be available. So I've written, I think it's now 7 books. Most of them deal with the history of the occult. That begins in Babylon in the 6th century BC. That was, my first book. That was the real task of uncovering, of pinpointing the time and location of the origins of it. It's based, of course, on much older legends, but that's really when they're formulated, and that's the world. Those are the ideas that continue to shape the world we live in today.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
so
think so.
I have a website called Order Ab Chao.ca, and that's where I feature most of my books. Several of them, 3 of them, are online for anybody who wants to read them, or they can be ordered in the paperback or Kindle. In fact, there's
Amazing.
audiobooks now available for most of them as well, too.
Awesome. Yeah, I highly recommend. I did do your first book as well as your other 2. I think I'm on 1 and 2, so I'm ready for the 3rd, and then
Okay.
multiple other things. But you're right
Yeah.
on. That was one of the things that I was going to talk to you about, is this Astarte and the sun god, right? Like these gods and this dualistic nature of Babylon. And people always say to me, well, what do you think Mormonism is then? And I'm like, well, I don't think you'll like it much.
Mhm.
Because they have the father, who they
Right.
call Elohim, and the mother, who they refuse to name. And she's just the mother of God. But I think you've named her. I found the
Yeah.
names, right? And I'd love
Yeah.
for you to tell my audience a little bit about that and
Right.
about what happened there.
Okay. Good. So, maybe what we could do then is effectively review a little Bible history, because that's what it's all about, right? So, like I said, the history of the occult. So, magic, black magic rituals, all that is very old, probably as old as humanity. But the specific version of the occult that has transferred itself over the centuries in a Western society is one largely based on, we're connected to the Hebrew Kabbalah, particularly the cult of the Magi, and has links to Greek philosophy and Egyptian mysticism like Hermeticism. But they're all rooted back in the cult of the Magi that developed in the 6th century BC. but even it itself is a modification or an evolution of earlier ideas. So that's why my first book is called The Dying God, and that's a dying God with a slash, because it's referring to a recurring motif deity that was worshipped through most of the ancient world. It was first popularly identified by James Fraser in his book The Golden Bough. An amazing book, amazing scholarship. I think he's probably a little partial to the cult, but that's the way it is with a lot of research these days. So you just have to filter it out. The story of the Bible is that God chose Abraham, and he asked him to look. He asked him to he asked him to sacrifice a son, and he prevented him at the last minute as basically a compensation reward for his faith. He told him to look across the land, and he said, "All this will be the land of your descendants." So that's effectively the beginning of the promised land. And his descendants bifurcated into two tracks because he had two sons. One was Ishmael, who's the ancestor of the Arabs, and they settled, of course, in Arabia. And then there was Isaac. And Isaac, his son, he had two sons in turn. Esau, Jacob. Jacob changed his name to Israel, and it's from him that you have the tribes, the 12 tribes, his 12 sons, who became the 12 tribes of Israel. They settled in Egypt. The population grew over about 400 years, according, I'm not sure what the specific count is. And then they were rescued by Moses, who took them across, of course, the Red Sea, and then ultimately back to the Promised Land. And there they were commanded to conquer it, away from people who are described as the sons of Anak. And that's a hint that they were descendants of the Anakim. So, I'm not sure how literally we can take these accounts of the Bible. If, in my take, this is not a Christian perspective, but my take is that the Bible has been modified. So there's a core truth to it, but there's certain elements which are legendary. And so the story of the Anakim is basically goes back now to the book of Genesis, which talks about the sons of God. So, this is word for word what it says, the sons of God who took the daughters of men. And so they were, in those days, there were giants in the land. There's very little explanation about what that is. There's no clarification exactly of who or what is mentioned. The word in Hebrew, I believe, is Elohim or Bani Elohim. It's been translated into English as sons of God. Place where we have this story more fully elaborated, and that's in the book of Enoch, which I believe was written in maybe the 200 or 300 BC approximately. Famously, a version was kept by the Ethiopians. Another was discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Am I getting that right? And so there it explains that the sons of God were actually Azazel, so it's effectively Satan and his so-called quote-unquote fallen angels, who came to earth, interbred with human beings, and taught them the sacred arts. So all the things of, herbs, magic, astrology, numerology, and all those things. And so that's the version that became essential, because that was the version that was used over the centuries to justify the practice of magic by a very select few who, despite purporting to adhere to the Orthodox religion in public, were actually practicing a satanic version of it, known originally as Gnosticism, but now has many manifestations. So the story is that the sons of Anak then were purportedly the ancestors of the Canaanites. So the Canaanites were the people who were living in Canaan, or what is today Palestine, in the Promised Land. And those are the people that the early Israelites were required, commanded to conquer, take their land. But this is where it gets important, is that they were told specifically not to worship their gods or to intermarry with them. And the Israelites, this is the entire story. This is not an anti-Semitic claim. This is the story. This is the primarily premise of the Old Testament. This is the story. The story is that the Israelites rebelled repeatedly. There were numerous prophets that were sent to try to reform them from this cult. They refused to. They were warned that if they failed to desist, that they would be they would be punished. That happened several times. First, the Assyrians came. They took the 10 tribes away. Babylonians came a century later. They took the remaining 2 tribes away to captivity. They took them to Babylon. Eventually, after the Persians conquered Babylon, they were allowed to return. They rebuilt the second temple. And then, many centuries later, the Romans became so frustrated with them that they decided to eliminate them. They conquered Judea. They destroyed the second temple for the final last time. The Jewish population has been living in exile ever since, and they have been harboring the wish since that time, expecting for their exile to be concluded, for the Messiah to return, to bring them back to the promised land, and to effectively grant them rule over the world. So that's a Judaism in a nutshell. Zionism in particular is a branch of Judaism. It's a very radical branch of Judaism. They have a particular radical approach that they take towards fulfilling that cult, and that's what makes it problematic. But now to get back to your original question, what was the cult that the Canaanites worshipped and that the Israelites illegally adopted? And that was a cult, again, of what Fraser called the dying God. So it was effectively a trinity. It was so first there was the male father God, and then he has a daughter, and then from his daughter he has a son, and then the son weds the mother or his sister and mother at the same time. So it's like a triple relationship. So it's the son and the daughter that are the most important, and they are the son S-O-N is symbolized by the sun S-U-N. And the mother is symbolized by the planet Venus. So the reason for that is because the whole cult then became centered on the path of the sun, particularly, it's the Earth, Earth around the sun, but the path of the year. So the idea was that the sun. So there's 4 points of the cycle that were important. You have Christmas, which is the day that he is quote unquote born. And then he dies in the winter and he's resurrected in the spring at the equinox, which is Easter. And then you have the longest day of the year, which is St. John's Day, December 24th, 25th. And then finally, you have the fall equinox, which is the close to Halloween. So this is why these 4 holidays persisted. So what was celebrated was that a phenomenon called the precession of the equinoxes, right? So the Earth as it rotates has a slight wobble to it. So what happens is that in the spring, when the sun is reborn at Easter, every sort of 2,000 years or so, he's born in a new zodiac sign. So what's important is that the cult is associated with the worship of the sun. And because the sun, Venus is the first star to be visible at sunset, then the sun and Venus were always considered closely interrelated. And effectively, that sun and his sister, spouse, mother was considered, the two of them together were considered sort of an androgynous deity. So what's important now, this is where this is a point that's really missed by many, because there's a lot of apologetics. There was a time when the Christian church, of course, dominated Europe, and so they could sort of, criticize this cult as being Luciferian or, satanic or so on and so forth. So the backlash these days is that there's an attempt to try to dismiss the Christian criticism as being, unfair, chauvinistic, or uninformed. But the reality is that if you look at all the ancient descriptions of this cult, and this is not just my opinion, there's academic studies to support what I'm saying, that this cult of the dying god was almost universally a chthonic cult. And chthonic means that it's a cult associated with the underworld. and typically evil. And evil again is not good, and evil is not a concept which is restricted to a Judeo-Christian tradition. It's also universal. It might not be called good. It might be called good and evil in some cases. It might be called good and bad. But typically, the cult of the dying god was considered bad. And so there's a researcher, a scholar, who I've said this many times. I think he's the greatest scholar of the 20th century. His name was Frans Cumont, a Belgian scholar. He's the one who exploded, formidable scholar who really explored in depth, because of his knowledge not only of Greek civilization, but his knowledge of Syriac, of Aramaic, and so on, and Egyptian history, Egyptian religion, Syriac religion. He was able to dissect the cult of the Magi and pinpoint it to Babylon. And he points out that this ancient cult is what was called, it's type of magic called apotropaic magic, which means that you sort of like an early dualism, right? It's not like a dualism where we have, well, it depends on the perspective, but you have God, the creator, who is the sole source of everything. And then so evil is an act of opposition, or contrary to the good. Evil is not created. And so the Satan is a being of free will who acts out of his own free will, contrary to the dictates, commands of God. But this in early theology, these two gods became, equal and warring, and that God, so effectively evil becomes sort of a force that's a force in itself. So in this apotropaic magic, you perform good acts for the good god, but you have to perform evil acts for the evil god to prevent to keep his evil away from you, or to direct it against your enemies. So, of course, the type of magic which to please an evil entity. And to come back to a point, so the story that was typical of the dying god, again, why he's called dying god, is because every year he goes to the underworld, right? So he's sort of worshipped as the lord of the underworld, because the underworld is perceived to be, in the Greek version, it became remembered as Hades, and is considered to be the realm where the souls of the dead depart to. And this is where we get our idea of ghosts. What they mean by souls of the dead is that they thought they were talking about souls of the dead, but what they were actually talking about was spirits, or demonic spirits. So this ancient dying god was apparently the ruler of the demonic spirits. And that's why you worshiped him, because he could command the spirits to do things on your behalf. So the worst, most evil act that you could do, of course, is to kill, to destroy innocent life, particularly a baby. And that's the cult that now we return to in the Bible. So typically what would happen is that the rituals that were associated with the dying god are normally called, the more later versions were always referred to as ancient mysteries. And the story is always the same. It's typically a story about the god descending to the underworld and coming back. And usually what happens, often he's at war with the Titans, and the Titans is equivalent of the Anakim, or the sons of God. And he's usually, like, especially in Greece, there's usually stories about him being dismembered and things like that. So typically these rituals would involve the child would sort of embody the dying god, and then he would be torn to pieces in an act of frenzy, and then the parts and flesh and the blood consumed. So what would happen normally is that there would be sort of like festivals, usually at night in the forest, far away from where anybody could see it. They would play music, loud music, drums, and so on. Sometimes they would involve intoxicants. So there's various intoxicants. There's various theories trying to guess what they could be. There's the haoma of the Magi. There's the soma that's mentioned in the Vedas. There's the Kaikion. I can't remember how to pronounce it. That was in the Eleusinian Mysteries. Nobody actually knows what they were. Were they sound like an alcoholic based or a narcotic based? But these drugs were then taken, and then with the music, they would sort of whip themselves up into a frenzy where they would become possessed. by the god as they understood it. And this is where the name, particularly in the Greek mysteries, this act of possession was known as enthusiasmos, I think is what it was, which means literally the god entering within or something like that. And yeah, so they would whip themselves into a frenzy. This would make them, become so wild that they could do things like kill a child. And the music was loud enough to, create a sort of a type of intensity that made that possible, made them able to sort of surmount their, normal moral inhibitions, and then typically followed by orgiastic rites. So this is what effectively the Bible refers to. So we're looking from the time of the return from the Exodus all the way until the Babylonian exile. We're looking at a period here where the Jews, the Israelites, repeatedly fell into this cult, and they were warned time after time. And specifically, the Bible refers to them as passing their children through the fire of Moloch. So Moloch is basically a variation of Baal, who was the sort of Canaanite version of the dying god, and Moloch was equated with the god Saturn, and this is why the god Saturn to this day, the god of the witches. It's the god is the seventh planet, which equates it with the seventh day, Saturday is Shabbat, so that's why you have the witches' Sabbath and so on and so forth. And yeah, so that's basically the cult, and as I said, this is what they were forbidden to do, and they failed to do. And so finally, when the Israelites were taken into captivity, Babylon, this was a warning fulfilled. So it should have been clear enough to them that, wow, we have been really rebellious. It's time for us. Oh yeah, the point I wanted to make is that the cult was so pervasive, and this is what we forget. They might have been Israelites, but the religion of Judaism was almost non-existent. Right? We're talking about an entire nation, civilization practically, because effectively they were one and the same with the Phoenicians. This is why they were unrecognizable, because they weren't practicing Judaism. On the whole, the vast majority were practicing this Canaanite cult. Even the temple itself was completely polluted. In the sanctuaries itself, the Holy of Holies had become a site of pagan ritual, and the practice of Judaism itself was really only restricted to a very small minority of reformers. So that when they were taken into Babylon, instead of reforming their ways, what they did is that it was there that they became introduced to the magical traditions of the Babylonians, and they took that and they mixed it with the dying god cult. And they also, in that same century, developed astrology, and that's where you get the beginnings of what Masons practice today.
So on that one of the shows that I watched of yours, there was like a perverted version of Zoroastrianism.
Right.
Is that what that is? That mixture right there? Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure I'm on the right track.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Okay, great.
Because what happens is that so the Persians were Zoroastrian. So there's two things, right? So first you had an earlier tradition of Babylonian magic, but then the Persians conquered Babylon in the year 538. And so the Persians were followers of Zoroastrianism. And what happens is that, so this is where it becomes interesting, is because a lot of scholars perceive what they think is a Zoroastrian influence, and then other scholars who don't understand what that means dismiss it because there is no Zoroastrian is the influence. And this is where Francis Cummo is so important, because he's the one who points out that no, it's not Zoroastrianism, it's heretical Zoroastrianism, which is completely deviated from Orthodox Zoroastrianism. And that's where you find not the worship of Ahura Mazda, but the worship of Mithras or Ahriman, which is the Zoroastrian devil, and then all these occultic elements like numerology and astrology, and that's the cult that gets imported to Greece and then evolves into what we know as philosophy, beginning with Pythagoras and Plato. So this is what's important, and this is what I had to reconstruct in my own education, is that Plato and Pythagoras are taken to be examples of the first sort of flourishing of rationalism when it's not. It's basically it's a rejection of traditional ancient Greek religion, but it's an introduction of this new Magian cult, and it's really from there that it enters the Western civilization.
Do they ever use the word, I know this is all about chaos magic and even Solomonic, which we'll get to in a minute,
Yeah.
but do they ever talk about, the chaos god like Typhon? Does he have a different name in this situation by chance? I'm just curious.
That's a good question. But I guess they're one and the same, right? It's always the same. So
Okay.
if you,
I only bring it up because in the temple, when we do some of these ancient rites, some weird
yeah,
stuff, they do the sign, like a Y.
right.
And they wear a green apron with leaves
Mhm.
on it. And this is all gonna totally make sense to you, but it didn't make any
Right.
sense to me. I mean,
Yeah,
it does now, but I didn't know then.
yeah,
And so they do this a
yeah,
lot. And so I thought, oh, I'm gonna ask him about that
yeah.
because they do it a lot.
Yeah, so that's a good point because the dragon, right, is always like a recurring motif in the Dying God legend. It's always a war of the Baal against the dragon Tiamat or by whatever name, even going as far back as the Baal epic, right? And that's where we get our dragon slaying legends, particularly transformed into figures like Saint George, which is very, very central, right? Because the St. George then becomes model for the various orders of St. George. And, in books, that's a pretty central organization because it was also the model for the Order of the Dragon. And that is a seminal organization, which really, you can trace so much of occult history back to that order.
Absolutely. And I that was one of them that I'm going to ask about, but before I
Yeah.
jump ahead, I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you about one you've covered most of the descendants that I knew of, but there's
Mm.
one that the LDS make a big deal about.
Right.
And I haven't heard, I mean, yeah, the House of David, but this one is
Mm.
the Nile of Nine. Have you ever ran across that on your studies? Because
The
this is Joseph
Council of
Smith's
Nine?
haplogroup. That it's the Nile of Nine hostages, and it's an Irish king, and they say that this is his haplogroup, so it's his paternal haplogroup. It's
Yeah.
R1B1, and
Oh,
it's
right.
specific about this Nile of Nine hostages. And I looked it up, and it's very Irish Celtic, of course,
Yeah.
but it makes sense because they have a claim to
Mhm.
this whole situation. They say they are literally from the house of David, and not that
Right.
doesn't mean they think so, or like
Yeah.
think about, we'll get into that because it's the whole
Yeah.
thing. But
Yeah.
they accidentally published their one right to rule line
Mm.
back in the day, right? And
Right.
this all comes up. And so, it's very interesting to me where it infiltrates, and it's you're so on the money with everything, and I
Mm.
don't want to rush ahead. But when we
Okay.
get to, like William Huntington and all these people, and
Yeah.
even, the Mayflower, that's where I'd love to
Right.
go after the gods here is the
Yeah.
Rosicrucians and the Mayflower,
Yeah.
because you said something that cleared something up for me that I had no idea what it meant. I buy all these
Mm.
old books because they're the only thing that tells the truth. Like they can
Mhm.
they can obfuscate anything online, right? They can
Yeah.
change it tomorrow.
Yeah.
Um, and somebody pointed out to me yesterday, that's why it's called a Kindle, because they can set it on fire if they want to. And I thought, well, that's pretty
That's funny.
smart. Yeah, I thought, oh, huh. So yeah, and I found this thing that said specifically about Joseph Smith's posterity that
Yeah.
they were running because they needed protection. It didn't say why. And I'm like, why are they
Mm.
in trouble? Well, you've obviously filled that in for me now.
Right.
And I had no idea what that meant. I was like, well, what are they running from? I thought we were just going to have, religious freedom,
Yeah.
but that's not true.
No.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
I'll let you finish first. Yeah. Yeah. It's all
Yeah. I don't know.
confusing.
I'm not sure where to. It sounds like what if I'm not familiar with it specifically. It sounds what you're talking about sounds linked to British Israelism.
Okay.
That's interesting. I'm not sure if you
Yes.
know about that, but there's
Oh,
a
yes.
whole right. So it's a whole
Yes.
trend. It dates back to the 1800s about believing that the uh, British are descendants of the lost tribes, ancient Israelites, and that's not too. It's a little wild in terms of where how they stretch the evidence, but it's not totally out of not totally far-fetched. because of course the Phoenicians apparently found their way all the way to England. What they trace themselves to they equate the Tuatha of Danann to the Danaans, right? The tribe of Dan. And there's a fascinating.
That's the Nile of Nine. That's
Okay, so there you go. So
uh-huh.
that's what it is. So because I talk about this in my book, The Dying God. There's a very highly respected Jewish historian. His name, one of the most famous of 20th century. His name is Raphael Patai, and he wrote a book called The Children of Noah. And so he explores all the evidence in the Bible and some other external evidence to suggest that at least the tribe of Dan were a seafaring people, which would equate them then with the Canaanites. And as I said, the Canaanites were effectively indistinguishable from the early Israelites. So there's numerous links as well too. One of the most important people in all these legends is the Scythians. And so the Scythians were people from basically the area of the Ukraine, the Don Valley Basin, and they just crop up everywhere in all kinds of legends. There's even there's the Declaration of Aberoth. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that properly. That was written by was it Robert the Bruce? When he again traced the Scots back to the Scythians, and apparently the word Scot, SC, sk is related to the Scythians, and the Scots were the Scythians were apparently red-headed. Red hair is fairly rare among human beings. There's it only among two peoples that you find it in high concentrations, and that's Jews and Scots. Another book that I quote many times is When Scotland Was Jewish. It's a fascinating book. From a scholarly's point of view, it's not outstanding. It's a rather amateurish book, but if you can sort of filter out some of the more sensational details, there are a few interesting points that they bring up. For a long time. So this is another part that I explore quite a bit because again, this goes back to the whole concept of Scottish Rite Freemasonry anyway, right? This is in particular to the Stuart family. And this whole idea then is resurrected in books like Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, where the Sinclairs, who are the hereditary Grand Masters of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, come from this family who are supposedly descendants of Jesus, and they're recognizable by their, of course, red hair. And red hair for most of the Middle Ages was stereotypically identified with the Jewish people. What was the last point I want to say about Scotland? Oh yeah, there's another interesting point is that one of the most detailed accounts about the origin of magic among the Magi comes from Pliny the Elder. I have it published on my site that this is the challenge about studying the Magi is there's so little literary evidence to support their study. There's mostly fragments. Most of them are basically fragments that have been, copied from somebody else. We don't have the originals. But one of the longest pieces and the most elaborate is one by Pliny the Elder, so written in the 1st century AD. And he says very specifically that magic originated in Babylon with Zoroaster and his disciples. But he makes one exception. He says there's one country where it seems it's so embedded into that society that he says you would almost think it began there instead of Babylon, and he says that's England. And this seems to be the connection of the Druid cult. I can't remember. There's an ancient historian. I think his name is Zalmoxis, or I can't remember what the account is exactly. But there was the claim. The ancient claim was that the Druids were the students of a student of Pythagoras. And Pythagoras, of course, as I show in my book, The Dying God, there's all kinds of links of him to the Magi. It's almost indisputable.
Yes. Yep.
So I
It's
think
wild.
the thing is, for particularly like a cult like the Mormons, I think it's constructed by people who are like, a lot of these tales you can find in Albert Pike, right, and his Morals and Dogma. So a lot of this stuff is sort of common knowledge in certain circles, and There is some literature available. A lot of this is legendary, but I would assume that the people who constructed the cult of the Mormons would be pretty familiar with most of the details. In fact, it would probably be, their driving motivation would be, to construct something from these secret traditions that they inherited somehow.
Oh, yeah, they definitely did. And that's
Mhm.
why I wanted to go next to the Rosicrucians and
Right.
Salem, because unbeknownst to most people, that is where the first settlers of Joseph Smith's paternal line is. It is
Oh, I
not
see.
in
I see.
Palmyra.
Right.
Yes. And the Wiccan stuff that goes into this, like you
Yeah.
mentioned it is one of the last things we say. It is actually the key,
Yeah.
health in the bones and marrow and all this crazy stuff. I don't want to say it all because I don't
Yeah.
like it.
Yeah.
But it is a key and it is Wiccan and it is a combination of these, mysteries
Yeah.
and the Aryan thought, which
Mhm.
we'll explain what Aryan means because nobody gets 100% what that means unless
Right.
you've done this work like you do.
Mhm.
But it gets very convoluted. We'll just say that.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because of House of Stuart. Like I said, that's where I'm from.
Yeah.
Henry
Right.
Stuart Talbot. All these things that don't make any sense until you pull it apart and say, why was Peter Till's great uncle the first principal of BYU, and he was brought here from Germany, and he was a great big deal in Utah, and nobody talks about that. His name was Carl Maser,
Okay.
Maeser.
Right.
Yeah. And then you go, there's some things going on that don't make sense.
Yeah.
They do on the overall conspiracy. Basically,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
not just Mormonism that it goes into, but,
No.
Templars and everything. And
Yeah.
it's very, very strange. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're the only one I've seen that's explained it in a chronological order where I went, yep. Because
Mhm.
my notes are just all over like a weird dartboard, and you
Right.
brought it a lot together for me. And that's why I really recommend your stuff. So,
Great.
yeah,
Thank you.
on we move to this Mayflower and the Rosicrucians, right? Or
Okay.
Masonry, whichever way.
Yeah.
Both.
So pretty fascinating story. There used to be a thing right back in, I guess, in the 50s. I don't hear about it anymore, but it was a very elitist sort of a thing to say that you're from the first families, right? So the descendants of the first families considered themselves more elite than the riffraff that came after them.
Mhm.
And so I kept seeing how many times certain people would openly claim their descent from the Mayflower, and I knew there had to be some significance. And I looked and I looked and I looked, and I tried to find some connection. I couldn't find it. And finally, after I don't know how many years, it was Alex Jones who explained it all to me. So Alex Jones published a video where he openly claims that he comes from a family of Masons. He's not himself one, apparently, so he says. And then he says that he's from the Illuminati, but he says he's not from the false Illuminati created by Weishaupt. He's from the real Illuminati of Rosicrucian tradition that came over on the Mayflower. And I was like, that's what it was. That's what I hadn't thought to look. And it was connecting the Mayflower to the Rosicrucians, and that's an easy thing to do. Particularly with what's his name? Brewster. I can't remember his first name. So I went there a couple of years ago. You can see the
Thomas,
spot pardon?
Thomas, the one that did Marymount.
Brewster,
Is
yeah,
that
last name
yes,
Brewster.
I think it's Thomas, but I'm not 100. I'm
Me
pretty
neither.
sure.
So the spot you can find in Leiden, where they marked the spot where the Mayflower leaves, because it actually leaves from Leiden in Holland before it goes to Plymouth in England, and then leaves from there to the United States. And so it's in Leiden, which is basically a Rosicrucian hub, because that was not long after the collapse of the Rosicrucian movement. So the Rosicrucian movement is a fascinating one in itself. I'm going to try to keep it simple, but I'll drop a few clues without giving all the details. But basically, the Zohar, which is the most important Kabbalistic book of modern times, begins by providing an explanation of the meaning of the symbolism of two different flowers. and one is the rose, and one is the lily. And the reason is that both of them are named in the Song of Songs, also known as the Song of Solomon. And this is a song about between the loved and the beloved. So it's purportedly between a worshiper and God. But this is why this book is so important, because the beloved is a she identified with the ancient goddess who was transformed, into Lilith or the Shekinah. Both are interchangeable. And so Zohar explains that the rose is a symbol, and the lily, because it says it's the rose of Sharon, right, in the Song of Song, or the lilies of the valley, which is also a famous line. And because the goddess, the she in the Song of Songs refers to herself as black. She says, "I am black, but I am beautiful," because she's the black goddess. She's Lilith, or the Shekinah. The rose is. It says that the rose is a symbol of the quote unquote Jewish congregation. And so this is where I begin to trace the influence of the families who all identified themselves with the rose. And this is where you get into the Wars of the Roses. And it's all families who are descendants of the participants in the early Crusades. And that's where we come back to the Templars and the Cathars in particular, because that's this entire network that was responsible really for the emergence of occultism, is the way it's referred to, but really this is Kabbalistic occultism, and in particularly in southern France, which then manifests itself particularly in various heretical cults like the Cathars, and into things like the legends of the Grail, and that's why these things are always associated. So one of the most important legends of the Grail is the legend of the Night Swan, which is written by Wolfram von Eschenbach. And he wrote that story at what's called a Singerkrieg, which is the song contest, which took place in Thuringia under Hermann I of Thuringia. This is in a part in Germany, which is close to, I guess it would be the area of Eisenach. This is where you have the cities, very important cities like Weimar, Jena, and places like that. These places become very crucial to the Illuminati. The story of the Night Swan is important because supposedly this knight is pulled by swans, appears, almost magically on the land, and then finds this maiden, and from her he has a child, and that child ends up being Godefroy of Bouillon, who's the leader of the First Crusade. So it was widely, it wasn't too hard to read between the lines that it was pretty clear that this meant that the Godefroy's father was some kind of a spirit. This is one of the two famous legends. There's the Swan legend, and there's the Melusina legend, which is sort of a dragon lady kind of motif. So out of his Hermann I daughter-in-law is Elizabeth of Hungary, and she becomes famous for the miracle of the roses. So she's out feeding the poor, and her husband catches her, and somehow to defend herself, she lifts her skirt, and all these roses come out, so you can see what the implied yonic symbolism is there. Because, of course, the rose is very much a yonic symbol, as a lily, of course, would be a phallic symbol. And so from Elizabeth of Hungary is to her that is traced the ancestors, the Landgraves of Hessen-Kassel. It's also her great nephew or something like that, who almost in memory of her created the Order of the St. George. And he was related to Sigismund of Luxembourg, who was the founder of, or Sigismund of Luxembourg based his own Order of the Dragon on the Order of St. George. And so now you have the confluence of all these families who are basically the families who are preserving, because what you have, this is what I explained many times, is that you have two elements that are important in preserving the occult tradition. You usually have certain literary personalities or scientists, sorcerers, like people like John Dee. These are the people who are sort of the practitioners, but they usually have patrons, and their patrons are usually these aristocratic families. So all these families are back and forth. This is why, most of all the Grail legends, like Cruche de Trau, his patroness was Mary de France, who was the daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, and so on and so forth. I go through all detail in my book. I don't need to repeat it here. So all these families are involved with the Cathar sect and the Grail legend and so on and so forth. But now, particularly from Elizabeth of Hungary, you now have the descendants, the hereditary Landgraves of Hessen-Kassel, and Hessen-Kassel becomes the birthplace of the Rosicrucian movement. But before that, the first important Landgrave would be Philip the First Landgrave of Hesse, and he becomes one of the chief patrons of Martin Luther's Protestant movement. Him and an entire network of Frederick the Wise and John Frederick, all people who could trace their descent back to the Knights Swan. And it was, I can't remember, I think it was John Frederick I can't remember. So he's the one who recommends to Luther to adopt the rose as his symbol. And it's a 5-petaled rose with the bottom rose being at the bottom. If you were to line that up with a pentagram, you could see that it's a downward pointing pentagram. So Luther,
which is on the temple at Nauvoo, just so you know.
Okay.
And then the opposite, they also have the pentacle, and pentagram. It's very interesting. I mean, very honestly, occultic. Very.
It's one of the most occultic cults, I think, in modern times. So it's all the descendants of Philip I who become the leaders of the Rosicrucian movement, particularly Maurice of Hessen-Kassel. He's the chief sponsor of the movement. It's in his domains that the first Rosicrucian manifestos are written. It's his cousin who becomes, the sort of the tool of the movement, and that's Frederick V of the Palatinate, and his arranged marriage with Elizabeth Stuart, who was the daughter of King James, who now is King James I of England. He becomes the first king of a united Scotland and England. And one of the pieces that was played at the wedding was written by Francis Bacon. And of course, according to Francis Yates, that whole Rosicrucian movement was a manifestation of the influence of John Dee, particularly on his trip to Prague. So this is the background now of this Rosicrucian movement, which in its own words was based on Magia and Kabbalah. What's interesting about the Rosicrucian movement is that they timed themselves. So the first manifestos were written in the early 1600s. I can't remember exactly what year, 1609, somewhere around there. But they didn't officially announce themselves to the world until 1623. And the reason why that date was picked was because it was the date of what are called the Great Conjunctions. And this is an alignment in the sky of Jupiter and Saturn. It's considered particularly important. It happens, I think, every 20 years, so it has different levels of significance. The most significant is every 400 years. So the previous one would have been 1223, and this one now, 1623, was considered to be important. And the reason it's so important is because in the Kabbalah, the Great Conjunction is associated with the arrival of the Messiah. So it was presumed that the star that the Magi followed to Jesus was a Great Conjunction. And this was an idea that was particularly advanced by Isaac Abarbanel. He was a very famous Jewish Kabbalist. He was the one who sponsored Columbus's voyage to the West. He's the one who led the Jewish population out of Spain after the expulsion on Tisha B'Av, which is a very important day. And so one of his descendants became the wife of Manasseh ben Israel. Manasseh Israel is a very influential rabbi in Amsterdam in the mid-1600s, and it becomes now his entourage is an entourage of Rosicrucians. And he was chiefly responsible for lobbying for Cromwell to allow the Jews to return to England because they had been forbidden from entering the country since 1290 when they were expelled by Edward I, I think is what it was. So now you have this entire circle, and that circle who are associated with Manasseh ben Israel, they're known as the Hartlib circle because they're associated with John Samuel Hartlib. You have the three in particular: Samuel Hartlib, John Dewey, and Comenius, as the Invisible College, and it's named basically after a similar mention in Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, of a sort of a Kabbalistic college that exists on this island somewhere in the unnamed location in the Pacific. And so Manasseh ben Israel succeeds in convincing Cromwell to allow the Jews to return to England. That's what they do. They set up it becomes the first synagogue in England, known as the Bevis Marks Synagogue. And from that point forward, it's mostly led by Sabbatians. And then the Invisible College itself transforms into the Royal Society. And so you have this entire network, which is made of like Sabbatian congregants of Bevis Marks, the Royal Society, who are all the interchanging connections. Groups like the Collegians and, of course, the Quakers were another important group. And then you have leading Kabbalists, particularly like Knorr von Rosenroth and Mercurius van Helmont, who was really chiefly the person responsible for translating or communicating the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria into, I guess it would have been German at the time. And so was really chiefly responsible for popularizing Kabbalah for those who couldn't read Hebrew, and it was an enormous influence. And this is where you get all these people interconnected. Of course, people like Newton, right? I think who was friends with Van Helmont. So this is the core of the Rosicrucian movement. There's also affiliated with a group called the Lantern, which was headed by a man named Benjamin Furley. And this is where John Milton was affiliated. So Milton is crucially important because he's the author of Paradise Lost. He's the one who famously said, "Better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven," and sort of became a model for modern Luciferians, particularly a period in the 1800s called Romantic Satanism. We can get to that later, but just to mention a part of his influence. And in that same group, you have people like John Winthrop, who was the founder of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But before that, you have the Rosicrucians. So what happens is that in 1619, the Rosicrucians decide to elect Frederick as the King of Bohemia, and it sets off the 30 Years' War. They are immediately defeated in what's called the Battle of the White Mountain, and they had to disperse. This is how people like Samuel Hartlib ended up in England. Many of them went to Holland, and this is where the Rosicrucian influence ends up in Leiden, and that's where Brewster becomes part of this circle. And now they decide to go even beyond. They're fleeing even beyond Europe. They decide to go settle in the United States, or the American colonies, that set up the colonies, modeled on Francis Bacon's New Atlantis.
The one that actually taught Joseph Smith, he was teaching him Hebrew, and it was underneath the Seixas, Seixas. This was apparently a really important Jewish person that had settled right about that same time.
The Seixas are a major family that I mentioned.
Gershom.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
Gershom Mendes. So Gershom
Mendes.
Mendes.
Him particularly. My God.
No, his son Isaac.
Wow.
So, that's why I wanted to ask you, because I thought I heard the dad come up, Gershom, and Isaac was his son. And so he learned Hebrew from them. And this guy is just next door neighbor. I mean, this guy's all over the place, like the first Thanksgiving and all this stuff. So I thought I'd bring it up now, since we're almost to, settling the US. I thought, those are the two names.
That's a majorly important family. I won't be able to remember all the details, but if anybody wants the details, I have a chapter on the American Revolution in my Order Ab Chao book, which is online. But basically what happens that, like I said, that the Bevis Marks Synagogue was now the headquarters of the Sabbatian movement. And they established at least 4 important sister synagogues in the United States. So one of them was Shearith Israel in New York. The other one was Mikveh Israel. Mikveh Israel is the Hebrew for Hope of Israel. It's the title of the book written by Manasseh ben Israel. Then there's the Touro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. And then finally, but not least, is Beth Elohim in Charleston, North Carolina. So all these families are all connected. They all appear to be Sabbatian families, and they're the founding families of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, headquartered in North Carolina. All they call them the seven fathers or something like that, the seven founders, and they were all basically Jewish Americans who had created
The
Scottish
seven.
Freemasonry, which
Yes,
of course
which
then
is
was taken over by
wild.
Edward Pike. And the Sykes family was one of the core families in that grouping.
Wow.
McVeigh Israel is interesting because uh, it was founded with financial support from Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was a close friend of Count Zinzendorf. Count Zinzendorf is a very influential person, right? He is basically the founder of the what's called the Moravian Church, Moravian Brethren. It was an evolution of the more of the Moravian Brethren, I think is what it was, that was founded by Jan Hus. And Jan Hus was his movement. The Hussites were supported by Sigismund and his wife, who were the founders of the Order of the Dragon. So it all interconnects. Zinzendorf himself was this is not my discovery. This is Margaret Key Schuchard who has exposed all of this. So he's exposed that he was a crypto Sabbatian. And then so from his basically, if you read any scholarship on the evangelical Christian movement, they all trace it back to Zinzendorf. All the founders of the Baptist movement, of the Methodist movement, can all be traced back to his influence. One of his primary influences, because his followers created what is called Fetter Lane Society in London. And so Schuchard's work, she basically discovers that William Blake's parents were congregants of Fetter Lane, and she connects Zinzendorf to, most importantly, Manuel Swedenborg. So again, this is all central. So Franklin was a member of the Nephsers, sort of Illuminati from Masonic Lodge. So now he's also the financial support of the Mikveh Israel Synagogue. Another founder of these, or congregant, is a very important revolutionary. His name was Haim Solomon. He was a member of the Sons of Liberty, and he was a Rothschild agent, interestingly enough, because the Rothschilds founded, Amschel Meyer Bauer, right, the founder of the dynasty, he got his start working with William William the First William the Second Landgrave of Hessen-Kassel. So the two brothers, William and Charles, they were the direct descendants, even hereditary monarchs of the region of Hesse, descended from Maurice of Hesse-Kassel, who was the original sponsor of the Rosicrucian movement. His brother Charles is not only a member of the Illuminati, but also a Grand Master of a Sabbatian Frankist secret society called the Asiatic Brethren. And the Asiatic Brethren are crucially influenced because they were the founders of a very important the first Jewish Masonic lodge, known as the Frankfurt Juden Lodge. It was known as the Nascent Dawn or something like that, and it became the model for the founding of the Golden Dawn, which of course is considered the most important, influential secret society of times.
Wild. It does really go into everything. I'm really wondering, not only did the Mormons get funding from the Rothschilds at some point, but also, there was a secret society that ran a lot of their governmental issues. And guess what they were called? The Sevens.
Okay.
I thought you might get a kick out of that.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So these guys were up to a lot of things, boy.
Yeah.
From there, I know you usually go into a lot of Martinism and different things. And that's where I dare say that Mormons actually, because they always say this as well, that they have the true form of Masonry, much like the Illuminati comment, which made me laugh. And so, they also formed their own Illuminati called the Halcyon Illuminati, but a lot of people want to just blame the Scottish Rite for everything, but I think they're missing it. And I very seldom see anybody talk about Martinism. I've seen you talk about it, which I would love to tell people about, because it just seems like it gets missed,
Yeah, it does. So Martinism, I think, is That's why, the Illuminati is almost like it's like a bait, right? It's like a false flag. It's like a, what's the word? It's like a false, it's a red herring, right? It's almost used to chase us away because apparently the movement was banned. So supposedly the story ends there. But even before, right at the height, the Martinist movement seemed to be more influential and certainly survives into our time. And what's interesting is that um, the whole nonsense that was advanced by Dan Brown, he didn't make that up. That's all based on a book called The Holy Black Holy Grail, uh, which is written by three authors. In fact, they sued him for plagiarism. But that book itself was basically those three authors. I think they're all Masons anyway. But what they were doing is that they were only exposing the Martinist mythology. Um, so, but what's interesting is about Dan Brown is that he studied. This is where he studied at uh, Phillips Exeter in New Hampshire, which is a very prestigious private school in New Hampshire. A lot of people have been there, like Gore Vidal, Mark Zuckerberg, and so on and so forth. And what's interesting is that it was founded by, I think it was a grandson of John Winthrop. And so just to say that, the connections are not that remote. But this whole idea, the whole Martinist cult, it's hard to know where to start because it's so deeply influential and deeply embedded. But basically, so the Martinist cult really was founded in the 1800s uh, by Saint Claude. Claude de Saint Martin, I think is what his name was. Himself was a follower of Pasquale, who was believed to be some kind of a converso, so basically a crypto Jew as well too. So he learned sort of like a Kabbalistic doctrine is what he taught, and so it became enormously influential. It becomes resurrected by a guy named Papis, who's a French occultist whose original name was Gérard Encausse. So yeah, you have this whole confluence. What's really interesting too is that there's a whole network that happens because it's called the occult revival. It's called the occult revival for a reason. One of the principal influences was an order called the Order of the Swastika, and to it belonged Edward Bulwer Lytton. And Edward Bulwer Lytton was initiated in the Frankfurt Juden Lodge, which was again this Frankist lodge in Frankfurt. So this is basically you're looking at there's an explosion of the influence of the Frankist movement. It converges into the Asiatic Brethren and the Frankfurt Juden Lodge. And from there, that's where it begins to penetrate, to transform into what's known as the occult revival. And a very important personality, of course, is Elena Blavatsky. It's the founder of the Theosophical movement. So these several traditions were all very closely intertwined. Blavatsky was also close to Garibaldi and Mazzini. Mazzini is considered sort of the successor to Adam Weishaupt as leader of the Illuminati. I'm not sure how true that is, but he's fundamentally influential. He was nevertheless the Grand Master of the Grand Orient of Italy, I think is what it was. And so this network of occultists included them. So you have all the disciples of Blavatsky, like Annie Besant, most famously. There's another lady, her name was Juliet Adams, who's less well known. And they were all friends with a man named W.T. Stead, William T. Stead. And William T. Stead was one of the early four founders of Cecil Rhodes's Round Table. And there's a fascinating article, which is in German, unfortunately, by Marcus Osterreiter, who's an excellent researcher. He's really the one I've relied on for most of my understanding of particularly the Shambhala movement. But he's the one who helped me realize that. He proposes that the protocols of Zion, because all of the recent scholarship that claims that the protocols are a forgery, they blame the Papist and her circle as being responsible or partly responsible in his network partly for producing that forgery. But as I show in my book, the forgery itself is a forgery of a book by Maurice Joly, who himself was a member of the Memphis Mizraim cult. which is very important. It was led by Adolf Krimier, who is really one of the founders of modern Zionism. And so yeah, so it seems like Pappas and his circle were responsible for uh, I'm not sure what happened, but somehow it was a woman named Juliana Glinka, who was a disciple, very close disciple of Blavatsky, and she basically transmitted a copy of the protocols to Sergei Nilus, and he's the one who famously first produced the first Russian translation. Then it was eventually translated into English, and the rest is history, right? It became what Norman Cohn called the Nazis' warrant for genocide. So
Yes. Yes.
it seems to be some kind of protocols that was produced by the Memphis Mizraim lodges, presumably, or something like that. I don't know if it's true or not, but for whatever reason, the same occult forces deliberately used the protocols to manipulate history in subsequent centuries. And what's curious then is that the Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which becomes sort of the blueprint that Dan Brown plagiarized, they claim that the protocols don't refer to a Jewish conspiracy, that the protocols actually refer to this sort of Martinist conspiracy that is working behind the scenes to produce a king of the world,
I think
or
they're right.
equivalent of a messiah. Yeah. Pardon?
I think they're right. I think they're right. Whoever
They're
that was.
kind of the same,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's,
Mhm.
I mean, it's out, this goes into some wild stuff. And that was,
Mhm.
one of the things that I love about you, because you'll go down, the whole line, like the Royal Society, and then the Knights, the Cirque, and the Knights of the Golden
Mhm.
Fleece, and all these
Right.
things, and the Asiatic Brethren. But you don't hear a lot about a lot of these. And one of my
Yeah.
favorite ones that I think people skip with you, a lot of times
Yeah.
they go over it, which I would love to when we get through this little piece,
Yeah.
is the Shikshini Nights, because there's
Right.
Mormons
Yeah.
involved.
Oh,
And
I see.
Carrie Thornley, I don't know if you know this, but Carrie
Oh,
Thornley was a Mormon, and he was raised
okay.
Mormon. And
Okay.
so, yeah, and Joseph Smith's dad was a Universalist. I mean,
Yeah.
this gets crazy. And I just
Yeah.
think, Joseph Smith's grandma on his mother's side was Gates, from Daniel Deacon Gates. These
Right.
are important people. Like,
Yeah.
this was like, and they
Yeah.
obfuscated everything. And I think, they hid underneath the guise of religion. And it wasn't just Mormonism. They split into spiritualism and all kinds of things. And I have a lot of proof about it. I'm going to be doing an episode, but it's very strange when you see it from the outside in, but then it makes so much sense when you start looking at, like, who settled that? Who did this? Who did that? Like, who are these people talking to or getting money from? And the Estes come up, all these very important people. It's just
Yeah.
strange. But yeah, the Golden Fleece and the Circle, I don't know how that fits in with, we were at Round Table, but,
Yeah.
or, I think it fits right about there.
I mean, there's so many changes. It's amazing how they all come together. The leader today, it appears to me to be Alexander Dugin. So he's pretty much the modern leader of Martinism. And he really ties all these threads together. So a lot of things converged into him. So he had two primary influences. One was a man named Raymond Abellio. Raymond Abellio I can't remember it's a pen name, but he calls himself Raymond because Raymond was a Cathar who had been one who was a real Cathar ruler in southern France who was identified with Lancelot. And Abellio was the god of, like, Bel Abellio was the god that was worshipped by the Cathars. So this is why he supposedly was an expert on the Cathars. And his friend was John Parvalescu. These are really the two sources of Hugin's occultism. Raymond Abellio happened to also be a friend of Antoine Pinet, and Antoine Pinet was the founder of the Circle, what they call the Pinet Circle, or Le Cercle, Le Circle. He was also a founding member because it was founded a year apart, of the Bilderberg conferences. So it's amazing how it all comes together. And now it comes back to, like you mentioned, the Shikshini Nights, because that's really where the story of the protocols go. And it's interesting because when you talk about Kerry Thornley, is that Kerry Thornley in his later years started to claim that he was part of some kind of, breeding experiment, and that he and Oswald were the children of Admiral Dönitz. And Admiral Dönitz was specifically handpicked by Hitler to succeed him. And this is how he was viewed in sort of the Nazi underground after the war. So it's really a bizarre claim.
Tell you a
Yeah.
little fun rabbit hole for you might be
Yeah.
on this crazy claim is to
Yeah.
look because Gay, the man's last name is Gay. He took over Howard Hughes's empire through the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, which then has a ton of money, which he gets to control. He's a Mormon, of course, and in the Mormon mafia, but he goes on to really be obsessed with electronic, the genealogy and getting all of that was done underneath World War II and the whole Hitler approve your Aryan certificate. And this went through with IBM, which makes sense because the Mormons and Gates, they're like related and nobody knows that.
Yeah.
But he also is a big funder of CRISPR technology and all this transhumanist and, teal. And it gets very strange. So it might be a fun one. I haven't gotten all the way down that hole yet, but I've been there. I've been breaching it. So
they all
IBM
seem
and
to be somehow interconnected. Because you mentioned the Aryan race. The word Aryan was coined by Friedrich Schlegel. Friedrich Schlegel, he was the son-in-law of Moses Mendelssohn. Moses Mendelssohn was a close friend of many leading members of the Illuminati, particularly Herder. Herder was also very influential in the development of the Aryan race. Friends with Lessing, Kant, that whole network who were centered in Weimar that I mentioned earlier. And so the whole point is what I probably well known is that I show that the myth of the Aryan race, or what's called Caucasians today, is actually a Masonic legend which attempts to claim that Europeans are descendants of the fallen angels, that the Aryans were created on Atlantis and they escaped and landed in the mountains of Asia. And that's why they're a superior race, because they are semi-divine and that they have been keeping the ancient wisdom over these centuries. And that effectively is so from Schlegel, this is what I choice in my book, Zionism. I show that Zionism and Nazism, or German nationalism, were twin children of Sabbatianism. So if you look at all the people who were involved in development of German nationalism, which evolved into Nazism, they were all typically Frankists or had Frankist associations, often linked to people like Blavatsky, the Frankfurt Juden Lodge, and so on and so forth. So that explains the source of Nazism, would make Nazism curious. So coming back to the Sheikh Shani Knights, the person who was responsible for popularizing, so as I said, the protocols were first translated by Sergei Nilus, but the person who was mostly responsible for popularizing them, for introducing them to people like Henry Ford, for introducing them to the Nazis and Alfred Rosenberg in particular, was a very fascinating character called Boris Brasov. And Boris Brasov was a Russian. He was sort of like a triple agent. He, according to one of his closest associates, he was also a crypto Jew, even though he is basically, borderline an anti-Semite. But he becomes what happens is that, after the Russian Revolution, you have the white Russians who were against the Reds, who many of them ended up in Germany, opposing or, pretending to oppose the Reds. They become active in this organization called the Aufbau. And the Aufbau included people like Alfred Rosenberg, who was the chief ideologue of the Nazi movement, and another very important personality, General Ludendorff, who was also, in fact, both Rosenberg and Ludendorff were members of the Thule Society. The Thule Society, of course, was founded by Rudolf von Bettendorf, who had studied Kabbalah under the Sabbatians in Turkey. So it's, again, just a Kabbalistic. There's, that Sabbatianism, racist Sabbatianism branched off in two directions. One of them was the Young Turk movement, and the other was the Nazi movement in Germany. So after World War I, Brasov now comes to the United States. In the United States, he's been referred to as, quote unquote, the brain trust of the America First Committee. So America First was originally a Klein slogan. If you read the Snopes article, apparently it's not, of course, but it's easily traced. It was repeated before by several presidents, but most of them were affiliated with the Klan. So the America First Committee was founded just before the lead up to World War, during World War I, to lobby to keep the United States out of the war, and it was funded by the Nazis. This is not my research. This is research of, I think it's Martin E. Lee. There's also Russ Bellant, who's written some amazing articles on America First, books on the America First Committee. Yeah, so the America First Committee was made up of Shikshini Knights, the Shikshini Knights of Malta, which is basically like a Russian branch that's affiliated with the Russian branch of the Knights of Malta, the Knights of St. John, and who have a fascinating history on their own. Involved there were people like particularly Sullivan Cromwell, the founders of Sullivan Cromwell, which is the firm that the Dulles brothers got their start with. It also produced what's called the Inquiry, that was headed by Walter Lippmann. And the Inquiry was chiefly responsible for shaping the outcome of the Treaty of Versailles and the Paris Peace Conference. And things like the Federal Reserve, of course, and all those goodies. Yeah, so basically, the America First Committee is a confluence of the Shikshini Knights, the Klan, the America Bund, the Silver Shirts, which is a very fascinating organization, which we don't need to get into, but that's where you get into the whole UFO cult. So out of the America First Committee, after the war, they transformed into American Security Council. The American Security Council has been referred to as the heart, my words, heart of the American industrial complex. And what they did is that they effectively used the whole idea of a conspiracy to instill the fear in Americans that communism, just like they did in Russia, that supposedly communism was a Jewish conspiracy. So they did the same thing in the United States. They built up this fear that communism was part of this left-wing Jewish conspiracy out to take over the United States. And that way they could, fan the flames of the Cold War and bolster spending and develop their military industrial complex. And what's important then is that the American Security Council, ASC, is really a seminal organization. And where really it all sort of comes together is the assassination of JFK, which is effectively was a Mossad operation, right? Because
Hermindex, right? I love this.
Yeah, so two things happened, right? So yeah, he was impeding their nuclear development, and he was against the creation of AIPAC. So it seems to have been a conspiracy that involved Hermindex, which is basically a CIA Mossad front, which included people like Roy Cohn, which is Donald Trump's mentor, in league with the Shikshini Knights of Malta, the ASC, the Klan, and the John Birch Society. And the John Birch Society really becomes, from that point forward, the chief organization to broadcast conspiracy theory across the United States, specifically focused on presenting it as a communist conspiracy, not necessarily Jewish, because what's interesting is that it had very close relationships. There was many Jews who were involved in the John Birch Society, but they have very close links with an interesting organization called American Jews Against Communism, I think is what they're called. And that's the organization that convinced Senator McCarthy to hire Roy Cohn. So this higher network of members of this Jewish anti-communist group then sort of had very close relationships with the John Birch Society. Itself was perpetrated by a group of rogue CIA agents under the leadership of the ghost, what's his name? Ted Shackley.
Yeah.
Ted Shackley. So basically, pretty much a team of rogue CIA agents. What they do is that after the JFK assassination, they end up in South East Asia, and they become enmeshed in the Golden Triangle heroin trade. From then on into the 70s, then they move into other parts of the world, but eventually they become embroiled in what's known as another Mossad operation, which is the Iran-Contra operation. And this is
And
really where you get the hornet's nest that produced the 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 underground fascist movement, really, that eventually succeeded in putting their man in power, and that man is Donald Trump.
Onassis is a fascinating deep dive when you look into that triangle
Right.
operation, let alone the connects to just so many people that you just shake your
Yeah.
head and go, wow. And know that, right?
Yeah.
It's very, I mean, and anybody that, is a Trumper, look, I'm not trying to dash your hopes and dreams, but here's the thing. The politicians are all where they're supposed to be because they're put there for a purpose. Whether it's
Mhm.
one side or another, it doesn't really matter. This is a business to them. But Roy Cohn, that is a fascinating rabbit hole.
Yeah.
There's have you seen the biography on him called Where's My Roy Cohn?
I don't think so.
Amazing.
Okay.
Check it
Okay.
out. It's really good. Yeah. And so, but
Yeah.
you probably already know the information, but it's a lot of fun
Maybe.
pictures.
Yeah.
Really
Yeah.
bad for Donald.
Very interesting character. And Roy Cohn
Yeah.
becomes interesting because he's a confluence in so many different ways, right? Like he used to uh I mean, people have described him and say that, in his presence you feel like you're in the presence of true evil. He used to according to the Son of Sam, and this is revealed by Maury Terry, who wrote the book Ultimate Evil. Cohn used to hold sex parties in his houses in Connecticut, and they were attended by the Son of Sam serial killer. And so, who was a member? This is another thread that I follow, right? So, he was a member of the Process Church. This is what Maury Terry exposes. Maury Terry also links the Process Church to Roy Radin, who worked closely with Evans, the famous Hollywood
Cocaine
producer, who was the
and
producer.
cocaine Bob too, right?
Right. Evans was the
He's the
producer.
Mormon ties. Yeah.
Right. So, Evans was the producer of Rosemary's Baby, right? Which was a film of Roman Polanski, whose wife was killed. Sharon Tate was killed by Manson, who herself was influenced by the Process Church. And then we come back to Dugan because Dugan is the modern one of the. He's not the recognized leader of the accelerationist movement, but he's definitely one of the chief instigators behind it. Because when you look at most of the current neo-fascist trends, he tends to be behind them. The accelerationist movement. So because the acceleration movement is basically comes out of the idea of the Process Church, it's the idea about trying to accelerate the end times. The real leader of it is a guy named Nick Land. And the movement is also linked with the Order of Nine Angles, which is a Nazi satanic order, and one of Nick Land's important influences is on, of course, coming back to Peter Thiel, steering committee of the Bilderberg Group.
Wow. And have you ever heard of the Alfalfa Club? You hear about this? You know what
It
this is?
sounds familiar, but no, I can't remember.
So supposedly it's just to celebrate once a year Robert E. Lee's birthday, even though they're tearing down statues and doing all these things. But even Obama goes and
Mhm.
it's not, it's Romney's are involved in this, and he was
Mhm.
even the president of it in 2019. But all of this stuff goes so much deeper, and that's why I tell people all the time, it's not one faction, it's all of them. They all work
Yeah,
together, and I think you show that almost better than anybody,
right.
because we can't be partial, even though I point out things, because Mormons fly under the radar because they're so
Mhm.
nice. That
Right.
doesn't matter. You have to
Mhm.
research things because they're all in
Yeah,
this together for sure.
right. Yeah.
Oh
Well, I think
boy.
Epstein is kind of should be making that clear, right? So he's palling
Well,
around
yeah.
at the same time with Marvin Minsky, father of artificial intelligence, Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, Noam Chomsky, right? So whose side
Oh,
is he on?
I know. I wish so many people would see, but it's still like they need a king, and
They
once
do, and that's
again.
and that's the what I call this is what if one this is the one lesson that I learned from writing my book, Order Out of Chaos, Order Ab Chao, is it's I didn't coin this term, I got it from somebody else. He calls it the conspiracy. And this is the hardest thing for people to swallow is that they don't realize that the conspiracy works by spreading a particular version interpretation of the conspiracy. This is what the Nazis did, right? Hitler, this is how, what's interesting is that this is what's so curious about the protocols is that are they real or are they not? Whether they are or not, Hitler used them to convince Germans that there was this Jewish conspiracy to bring Bolshevism to Germany and that they needed to prevent it. And so Trump effectively is doing the same tactic. And this is why the Shikshi are so important, because this is what they did. They brought that tactic, they brought it to the United States, and particularly through John Birch Society, they're the ones. Most of the conspiracy culture in the United States is from the far right, and it's because it's manipulating the public. It's manipulating a perception, of particular perception of the conspiracy, convincing, unfortunately, naive Americans that they need to take down these, representatives of the conspiracy and overthrow them. All they're doing is that they're doing it on behalf of the people who are their true enemies. And Donald Trump is, if anybody still has any kind of faith in that character, he's the master. I mean, I've never seen anybody who was, so skillful in playing such a, so two-faced, talks so well, is, recruits so people so easily, but to the worst kind of deception, the most transparent kind of, treachery. There's a great article that I quote. In fact, in my chapter on the America First Committee, he points out that the fascist far right has a challenge because the fascist far right is an elitist movement, but they need votes from the masses. So how do they do that? They have to do that by speaking populist jargon, and they don't mean it, but they're going to tell you all the things you want to hear. They're going to tell you the government's bad and they don't look out for you and they're all a bunch of crooks and we need to drain the swamp, right? And that's effectively what's happening.
Wow. Yeah. And there's so many, just when you think you have a little bit of it figured out, like there's 10 other things, it's
Layers of
such a
onion.
spider web. Yeah.
Mm.
Like it's actually wild. And, the Templars and all their stuff and all these different societies. And you just go, wow, like I thought America was formed for this reason, but really, I don't think it was that anymore. They had to bring normal people, right? Like they had to cover their steps, but unfortunately, I always compare it to porch masonry, right? Like here's a lot of us that are just porch people
That's
and
it.
we don't want to know.
No.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
me, but
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to know too much
Yeah.
probably. But
Yeah.
I mean, look at how many things we've talked about today. Like, and it's just a drop in the bucket. I mean, you've got so many books and they're thick. They're not like, I mean, they're
No.
not
Yeah.
little books. Yeah,
Mm-mm.
this is
No. I
serious.
tried to keep them small.
No, I don't
No.
think you can. I mean, if
No.
you're really going
Yeah.
to do it justice, I mean,
It's a problem.
how do you wrangle all that in when you
Mm.
start in Babylon and come clear to today?
That's it. That's it.
Oh my
How
goodness.
do you succinctly cover 3,000 years of history? It's
Wow.
not easy.
That they're hiding and trying to take away pieces of every single day. We are a population with amnesia.
Yeah,
And they want to keep it that way.
that's it.
There's a reason why they don't want you studying the occult. And I'm not saying everybody needs to go as deep as maybe you or I have, but I
Mm.
found my answers there. And
Right.
I was led there and I thought, this is crazy. This is a nutty thing. I don't want to do this. And I kept feeling it was John D that I learned a bunch of things from. And I went, okay, these things that we were doing are not good, and I
Right.
knew it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the fortunate thing is that from a young age, I had a really hard life.
Mhm.
And I think God finds you when you almost die a few times.
Mhm.
uh, and I just had God and I knew that. But, when I went and got my temple rights, I wanted to run, not walk out of there
Mhm.
quickly. And, your whole family's there and everybody, I mean, you're born in it. You're expected to do certain things. It's
Yeah.
different,
Yeah.
so you stay. But yeah, everybody, all these people are born in it. Like, look at all the relations that I've even just given you a little bit. Like, there's a ton.
Yeah.
All this Mormon stuff branches into the, theosophy, spiritualism. You'd be shocked. Like,
Mhm.
and they did this knowingly. They did this through the railroads. They did this through the banks.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're no dummies. That's for
No.
sure.
Yeah. It's curious.
Yeah, it makes me wonder if that's where they're just, siphoning through all the Templar money, oh, sorry, we had a big loss here. Or we had a big find here of this thing or that thing. Oh, look at all our money we got. But they own the Federal Reserve, so who cares, right?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. That's a lot. I mean,
Yeah. Well, it's all
down to the
interest-based
dollar.
money. So it doesn't
Yeah.
exist.
Yeah. Yeah. I know you talk about the dollar bill and what's on
Yeah.
that. Like
Right.
all of it's bananas. I
Yeah.
mean, and that's why people don't believe us. Well, did we miss anything there? I mean, I know we missed a lot, but I mean, for our chat today.
Yeah, I think that like you said, there's a lot of detail that's possible. There's even some important tangents that are probably missed, but I think it's a good covered a lot of ground, and I think we covered a lot of
Yes.
important points that tap into most of the things that we're concerned about. So,
This is all fascinating to me. I mean, I would love to even have you come. I know you branched on it just a little touch, but
yeah.
the nine are really important. And Andrea
Yep.
Puharich is a rabbit hole, and that's a
Okay.
fascinating.
Yep.
So anytime, but
Okay.
yeah,
That's not because
we,
that comes back to Dugan as well too, and the solar temple
yes,
and that whole string, and
isn't
then
that
10 grams Da
strange?
Vinci Code again. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And the
Mhm.
Da Vinci Code, funny enough, the Mormons really pumped that up. Just
They did.
saying, well, they say they are from, so Joseph Smith
Mhm.
himself said he was from the actual blood of Jesus Christ.
Right.
And
And
he
yeah.
said Mary Magdalene and the line of David. So if you'll notice on the temples, you'll
Mhm.
see fleur-de-lis everywhere. They tell you right
Right.
in plain sight. They don't hide anything,
Mhm.
really. It's everywhere. Even their sigil for the priesthood is the mammon
Mhm.
sign, the mammon sigil, except it
Mhm.
doesn't have the little insignia in the center, right? That's it. That's all that's missing. But the
Mhm.
geometric shape is there. It's all right
Very
there.
curious. Yeah.
It's crazy. But yeah, this has been wonderful. And I hope my audience checks out. You guys got to get his books. Like the first couple, I know I did there was like a Nazi one and a Jewish one and then the Zionist. I don't know if that's all together, but I did the other gods one. I've done quite a few of them. I'm trying to remember right now
Yeah.
because I
So
know their
Dying God would be my
numbers.
first one. Dying
Okay.
God, History of Western Civilization. The other one after that is Black Terror, White Soldiers, which is a history of fascism. And then I think probably the one that's like probably the funnest read because of what it covers is the transhumanism, the history of a dangerous idea. It covers a lot of different aspects like discordism and Gary Thornley that we talked about, and Peter Thiel and accelerationism. And then
And the Zionist one, which one is that
so
one?
it's
Which that was
Zionism. So then after that it was Order Ab Chao, which is a 6 volume set, and then it's Zionism, history of Jewish heresy, and then my latest one
that's a
is
good book. Yeah.
Divide and Conquer. Yeah.
I like them all, but that book, I guess for me, explained a lot. Get them all, you guys, but at least start with that first one. You'll see what we're talking about. It's a lot, way more than he he said right here. I remember my husband asked me one day, "What is wrong with you?" And I said, "I think my brain's gonna explode." And he was like, "Why?" And I was like, "Oh no, this is way too much. Like, if you want to do it, get the book." So you guys, one more time, check out his website. Will you let them know again what that website is?
Thank you. So my website is ordoabchao, that's .ca, not .com. And again, that's where I feature links to all my books, but there's also 3 of them are online if you want to read them there. I also have a link to my Patreon. You're welcome to join me there. That's where I
Mhm.
get my financial support, so which I much appreciate. If you want to join, it's also where I share information. I used to be on Facebook, but Facebook's the enemy, so I don't do that anymore. Patreon is where I share, regular updates of what I discover. I have discussions with my audience and things like that. And yeah, I think that covers it.
Fascinating. Like you guys saw how it was here. It just flew by. So you're probably going to want to go and join his Patreon. Seriously. I'm probably going to join your Patreon. So if you see me pop up, you'll know. I love it. Honestly, like, and also they're on Audible. as well. Some of your books are on
Correct.
Audible. So I just really like that because then I can pop it in when I'm like doing the dishes or mom
That's
stuff,
great.
you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
when I'm doing my mom stuff. So thanks again, David. I appreciate you so much. And this has been great. I really appreciate your work. So
Thank you, Heidi. It was a real
thanks.
pleasure and an honor.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. All right. Until the next time, you guys have a good one. Bye.